Welcome back to the Corporate Sustainability Education channel. We are a series of educational podcasts and we're powered by the Southern Sustainability Partnership. Our fact for this podcast: no, 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 the sun does not need to be shining for your solar panels to be generating electricity. Yes, our topic for this podcast is indeed solar panels. An incredible technology, actually a really simple technology when you find out more about it. It does last for decades. It's been proven to do so in the UK too. Seemingly, it never has a duvet day, and it takes very little, really, once it's up and running. It asks very little of you, should I say, once it's up and running. I think it was Leonardo da Vinci, going back to, don't quote me on it, but I think it was around the 1400s who came up with the idea. It just took us a little bit longer to get on board. We've got solar panels powering this very podcast, and as you probably can tell, we are solar converts. So to help us to do justice to this important topic, we called on Craig Clark, who is Director of Technical Delivery at Briar. And Briar is the technical division of UK energy management company Zenergi, which is Zenergi, and they're based at the Southampton Science Centre, Hampshire in England. And this actually is the second podcast in the series that we're going to do with Zenergi, so do look out for that one as well. Craig, thank you very much for agreeing to join us today.
Lovely to be here.
Thank you. Help me out here, Craig. Solar panels and sunshine. Do we need to have sunshine, or in actual fact, am I the one that's wrong here?
No, you're not wrong at all. So it's actually daylight that affects the performance of PV. So it's the photons in daylight. So yes, there is a correlation. On a sunny day, there's more daylight, there's more photons getting into those PV panels, but it doesn't need to be direct sunshine. In fact, actually, the heat from direct sunshine has a negative effect on panels and actually affects the performance of panels. So probably quite an interesting fact. You can often get better performance from a panel on a cold, sunny day than a hot, sunny day, if that makes sense. So no, you certainly, I know there's this misconception in industry, or not in the industry, but with the layman, that you need direct sunshine for a panel to work. That isn't correct. If on a cloudy day, there's still a significant amount of daylight. Yes, depending on the amount of clouds, the amount that the panel generates will be reduced, but it will still be generating regardless.
Thank
Hope
you.
answers that.
Yes, and thank you for putting straight on that one. Okay, so say I'm a business owner. I've got a building, or buildings for that matter, and why should I be looking at solar energy to power my business?
Okay, so there's different agendas, clearly. Some people purely have a financial agenda, and that is it needs to pay for itself in X amount of years. Some people really want the kudos. They want to be seen to be green with their competitors. They want to broadcast that, market that. Some have a carbon agenda for various reasons, an energy, a carbon agenda, which obviously links to the previous. But in reality, all three should really stack up regardless. It's still the simplest form of renewable technology. It always has been the simplest form of renewable technology. It still is the simplest form of renewable technology. And you're talking give or take, and it's obviously relative to the individual, but a 10-year return on investment, something like that, which I good luck trying to find a bank that will give you that kind of investment, really. So it's a no. To me, it's a no-brainer, regardless of what your agenda is. As I say, there are different agendas, but to me, it's a no-brainer.
So say, for example, somebody is, a fan of the channel, and they haven't even really considered solar energy, but they thought, okay, it's the latest one, I'm going to give that a go, I'm going to have a listen or a watch. What would your advice be to them to start thinking about it?
Yeah, sure. So I think we've all seen, regardless of whether we're talking residential or commercial, the cost of electricity is only going one way. It's high now, and it's only going one way. The cost of PV is actually less now than it was 5 years ago. There's reasons for that, but it's still a great investment. I think there's probably again this misconception that now the feed-in tariff's ended, it's not a worthwhile technology. That certainly isn't the case. I'll keep hammering home the point, but it's still a really good return on investment, and there are likely to be other factors that come into play as well. Carbon taxing, additional carbon taxing, depending on what field you're in. So it's definitely worth considering. It's definitely worth, even if you start looking at a high level for your individual needs. I think you'll pretty quickly realise that it shouldn't be ruled out.
So let's look at the scenario where I'm a business owner, but I don't own my building, I rent it, but I pay a hell of a lot of money in electricity to run my business. I'm in the business for the long haul. I'm in this building for the long haul. What are the chances of my landlord agreeing to me investing in solar energy? And how can I sell them that concept?
Sure. Okay. So first of all, PV is an asset to a building. So if you add PV to a building, it directly relates to the value of that building. So you could invest in that PV, and you'd obviously need to write up the correct and appropriate agreements with the landlord to make sure that you're the person that's benefiting from that PV, if that's the route that you go down. But the selling point to him is that if and when you move out, he's got some kind of assets that's on the building. It's not going to hinder him in any way. There's not going to be a load of increased maintenance costs for him to adhere to. Yeah, you've got to write the correct kind of agreements in place. And there are other agreements whereby you could look at a third party funding it, whereby they fund it and they reduce your energy bills and they get some benefit and you get some benefit. But ultimately, in terms of selling it to the landlord, he's going to end up with an asset.
I feel that, we all drive around industrial estates today and see empty buildings. If you can do something that will give your building an edge and it won't be sat empty in the near future, then kind of makes sense to me, really, to look at, what's going to give you that asset, like as you quite rightly pointed out. Okay, so
just to add on to that as well, I mean, that very good point. If you're looking at renting a vacant building and you're looking at renting out in future, that should be seen as a positive to a prospective tenant. That they're going to have some kind of reduced bills or green energy or whatever that may be. So it should be seen as a positive to prospective tenants, as well as if you're the tenant right now.
I rented this building, say, and I've got roof space, so that's a given. But I've also got land. I don't need as much car parking, whatever, that the company before me that used the building needed. So obviously there is a roof system to consider, or ground mount. If I've got both, should I be considering both? And does one have more or less cost implications than the other?
Yeah, so there's pros and cons to both. I think everyone's probably noticed there's a lot more, certainly in the kind of industrial, commercial, residential market, not necessarily generation market, but there's a lot more roof mounted systems. The main reason for that is because people generally prioritize ground space. It's more precious. If you're a school, you'll want to use it for playing fields or new classrooms. If you're in an office, you'll generally want to use it for car parking or whatever that may be. So that's the reason why you see more roof mounted systems. But there are pros and cons to both. Believe it or not, ground mounted systems are generally more expensive. Yes, you haven't got the kind of scaffolding costs and whatever, but you've got more ballasting costs. You've got to weigh the systems down. Caveat to that is obviously flat roofs. You still need to ballast PV on flat roofs. But you've got things like shading to consider. So you can't just mount ground mounted PV right next to a building. Well, unless you're very lucky in the orientation of that, you're going to have shading issues if you do that. So they're going to need to be a decent distance away from the building. Less of an issue, but still ultimately an issue. There can be vandalism issues. There can be security issues. They're not particularly heavy, these units. They can be prone to being stolen or vandalized. You need to think about that if you're going to ground mount the units. A pro to ground mounted is that you're not governed by orientation and pitch. You create your own orientation and pitch. So you mount them on the ground and you get the optimum pitch and angle to suit yourself, to suit your orientation of buildings. Whereas on a pitch roof, certainly you have no choice for that, really, or limited choice for that. You're putting them on as southerly facing roof as you can, and your pitch is dictated by the pitch of your existing roof. So there's pros and cons to both. I think in answer to the question, really, it's not one size fits all. It's not you should be doing this or you should be doing that. It's look at everything in its merits, and that will dictate which system is best for you. But invariably, unless you're sort of talking somewhere fairly rural, you're probably going to end up coming to the solution of a roof mounted system, just because of the shading constraints.
Yeah, and I can see a point, and especially I suppose in a country as small as ours, every bit of land is precious. And I guess if you do use that area of land and then you want to move on with that building and sell it or whatever, then obviously
Yeah.
you've restricted, haven't you? So yeah, they're good points on both, but thank you for making them.
Mm-hmm.
So before I make a decision to go ahead and talk to you guys and look at renewable energy,
Yeah.
do I need to involve my energy provider?
You don't necessarily need to involve them at that stage. You will need to involve them for sure. In reality, unless we're talking huge systems, there's unlikely to be an issue. That said, you 100% they need to be made aware when a system is progressing, and it needs to be made. They need to be made aware at feasibility stage in reality to check that there's capacity in the system, and that it can cope, and if there's any infrastructure issues and whatever. But in terms of approaching a specialist to start looking at it, I wouldn't advise you necessarily speak to energy provider as early as that. Let us do that at the feasibility stage, really. But just to drill home the message, if PV is going to go on your site, yes, the energy providers do need to be made aware that that's happening. You can't just go ahead and do it.
So that said, what about planning permissions or anything from a local authority, or indeed anyone, before making a decision?
So PV systems can be permitted development, so there's constraints around that. So if you're on a pitched roof, it needs to be the PV needs to be at least a meter away from the edge of the pitch. It shouldn't protrude more than 200 mil. If you're on a flat roof, the PV shouldn't be more than a meter above the highest part of the roof, discounting chimneys. If you're putting a ground mounted system in, it's permitted development if it's less than 9 meters squared, but it also needs to be, I think it's 5 meters away from the site boundary, and it can't be more than 4 meters high. Which in reality, if I'm honest, you're probably going to be needing planning permission for most ground mounted systems, unless you're talking a domestic ground mounted system, probably not, but anything commercial and above, you're probably going to be talking a bigger system than that in reality. The obvious caveat to that is that if a site or a building is listed or has an ancient monument, a listed monument on it, you regardless of what it is, regardless of whether it's a shed on that site, you need to apply for planning permission.
So I think really it's a case here of don't sweat these things. Just call a company in that can look at all of that for you, and then just say this is the scenario. This is what you're facing, and make it easier for yourself. Really, as a business, you've probably got a lot of other things to worry about. So look at the financial gains and get someone in that knows best about this, rather than worrying about it yourself.
Absolutely. And any specialist will be aware of pretty quickly, to be honest with you, whether you're going to likely to need any planning conditions. So don't worry about it as a building user.
Yeah. Solar energy still makes so much sound financial sense in the commercial setting today, and you've obviously alluded to that. And yet, in my opinion, having worked in renewable energy in the past, many opinions are still stuck in the past of those gravy train days, if you like, when the government were pushing people to get on board with renewable energy, and the way they did that was to financially incentivize them. So are they right? Have they missed the gravy train? Have they missed the boat? Or is this still something that they should be looking at?
I mean, we're obviously talking about the start of the feed-in tariffs, 2010, the government offering 55 pence per kilowatt hour for generated electricity. I mean, looking back now, that was it was never going to be sustainable, to be brutally honest with you. It did what it needed to do. It got the uptake happening. But it certainly, I mean, people have cashed in big time on that, and it's done what it needed to do, as I say. But I certainly don't think that there's in any way you should consider it as missing the boat. It's again, maybe repeating myself, but a 10-year return on investment is still a very good return on investment. It's also worth noting that when the feed-in tariff was around, the cost of the panels was reflective of that. So you might have been 55 pence, but that was not for very long. It went down pretty quickly to a more appropriate level. But the return, we were still seeing similar return on investments to the 10-year payback that we're talking about now, when the lower level of feed-in tariff was in place because of the cost of the panels. And it's also worth noting there was a lot more risk in the industry back then as well. There was a lot of, I hate to use the term, but cowboys installing PV panels, because every Tom, Dick and Harry jumped on the bandwagon because it was so much around. And we've heard some horror stories. Let's put it that way. And there's a lot less of that going on now. You kind of, the cream's floated to the top, if you want to put it that way, and you've got the decent PV installers still around, carrying out the installs now. So it's by no way, shape or form should you consider that you've missed the boat. It was, of course, I'd love to get 55 pence per kilowatt hour on top of my roof, but there was very few people that benefited from that sort of level of income. And I would still encourage anyone to look at the business case. You don't have to jump in 2 feet forward, but look at the financials at high level in the first instance, and I guarantee you'll be surprised.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Looking at what the cost of the panels and what an install was then, looking at it now, it's sensibly leveled to where it's come through other people paying those high prices. It's leveled off. It's also enabled the country to get on board with the technology and to get some really, really good sound installers that are in it for the long haul. So yes, absolutely. And so, can you explain to our channel audience what the feed-in tariff is and how it works?
Sure. So the feed-in tariff ran from 2010 to 2019. Effectively, the government created a rate that degraded pretty quickly across that period, and that rate was a paid rate per kilowatt hour of electricity generated from your panels through a generation meter. So if you imagine when we use that 55 pence per kilowatt hour as an example, if you generated 100 kilowatt hours, you get 55 quid or whatever it is. Forgive my maths if that's wrong, but that you get the gist of that. On top of that, you're obviously then not paying for the electricity that you would have been paying from the grid, because that's being used on your site. Ideally, anything you don't use would then potentially be returned to the grid via an export tariff, and you would get some export feed-in tariff rate for that as well. So it was, I like the term you use, gravy train. It was good money while it was there, but there were, as I say, there were cons to it as well, because of some poor installs. And we're still, even though the technology ended in 2000, new installs, it was counted for new installs from 2019. We're still supporting users that have had these installs 5+ years ago that haven't been claiming the RHI because of poor installations, poor metering installations, poor setup, poor contracting, contractors going bust. So that's essentially how it worked. It did what it needed to do, but unfortunately, if you move forward with a new installation now, that's not an option to you. There's an alternative scheme. There's a smart export scheme that is in place, but not a generation scheme, so to speak.
Well, you've brought me up to date there, Craig, because I must admit, I did think that there was still a small incentive there for commercial businesses. But obviously, the fact that the enormous impact that it can have on the cost of reducing the cost of your electricity, like you say, is just a no-brainer, because the cost of electricity now, and for businesses more than the domestic use, but they are only going one way for sure. And I know it's had a big impact on the cost of what I'm running now that we've got solar energy.
I probably should have said. I probably should have said that if you had installed it prior to 2019 and you'd registered it, you can retrospectively claim those feed-in tariff rates, and any installs between 2010 and 2019 are guaranteed for the life of the 25-year feed-in tariff life, and that's index linked as well. It's just new installations that you wouldn't register it as a new installation now.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. That's a good point to clarify. So I've had my solar panels installed, and I'm finding now that I'm not using all of the energy that I'm generating. Is there a way that I can look at other things that I can bring into my system where I can take full advantage of that excess?
Yeah, so I'd say that the three obvious ones really. If there's any tasks that can be performed during the daytime that currently maybe would be getting performed in an evening, or when there's less generation, that's obviously a benefit. If there's no, if it's not affecting you in any way to do it during that time, great. Electrical vehicle charging is getting big. So a lot of people have electrical vehicles now. We're seeing massive uptake of electrical vehicle charging, so that's a great one. Making sure that vehicles are getting charged in the daytime and making use of the solar to power those. And then also, and in my personal professional opinion, the technology is not where it needs to be quite yet, but battery storage is getting better and better. It's definitely worth keeping a close eye on battery storage. I think generally we're seeing if it's not paying for itself right now, battery storage, when it's being looked at from a commercial case, but I suspect in the next 2 to 3 years it will be. So that's something to really consider. But those are kind of the three things. The first one is kind of a common sense approach, really. If there's something that can obviously be done during the daytime period when you've got the best benefit from the solar, do it. But the other two are going to become more important, to be honest with you, because they're bigger users as well.
I must admit, we get very excited when we go for a meeting. Well, I remember those days once, and you walk past a company and you can see vehicles charging outside in the car park while they're at work. Oh, we still get so excited about that. I don't take pictures of it anymore like I used to. I've got enough of those, but anyway. Okay, Craig, so let's move into the more technical aspects of this decision, if we may. So how do I know if my building and its surroundings then are suitable for solar panels, and how is that demonstrated to me so that I can make an informed decision?
Yes. Okay. So we talked about shading before. That's a big one. If you've got a single story building that's heavily shaded around you, you're probably going to be struggling to get the level of impact that you'd want. But if you've got relatively low shading in an area, that's a great tick box. You're going to want to look at your electrical infrastructure, where you're connecting into, whether it can cope with it. This is probably where you're going to start the feasibility process, if you want to put it that way. So you're going to want to start looking at the G99 and advising your district network operator that you're looking at the system. The condition of your roof. That last thing you want to do is just assume that the roof will be okay and we'll take it. So not just the condition, but whether it can physically take it. So you may need to get a structural engineer or a building surveyor or someone like that involved, just to make sure that it can cope with that. The pitch, the orientation of the roof, if you're doing a roof mounted system. If you're doing a ground mounted system, if you're locating that so remotely from a building that there's a huge cable run, that's going to impact on your on your return on investment, because if the capital costs go up significantly to account for the cable, you need to allow for that. They're probably the main fundamental things to consider. There will be other considerations. There will be site-specific factors that may come into play, but they're the kind of fundamental ones that you're going to be thinking about for most projects.
So when we're looking at the size of a solar array, we're looking at the kilowatt hours that we can generate here. So if I've got a large roof, you're going to come in, you're going to look at the energy that I need to use now for my business. We're obviously going to have a conversation probably about future growth, so that this system is already ready for that growth. But in your opinion, is it always best to go for as many as you can get on that roof, or use level expectations as to what you're going to need, really?
There's not a right or wrong answer to that. So, but if you want, if your agenda is the best business case, the best return on investment, you're going to want to either size it to your current demands or size it, fair enough, size it to known future expansion. By putting the biggest size possible on your roof, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but you're going to be exporting quite a lot. So if you imagine your export rate is 2.5, 3 times less than your generation rate, that's where your business case kind of, it doesn't fall over because it's still great. But if you can make sure you're using everything that you generate on a roof, or the majority of what you generate on the roof, on the site, you are getting that kind of 15 pence per kilowatt hour benefit from not having to pay for it from the grid, and the rest is kind of a lower rate, which you're not getting the same return on investment on that capital expenditure, if that makes sense. So yeah, unless you my personal opinion is, unless you've got a planned project, or you've got known future expansion, I would size it to what your current demand is, because at the end of the day, it's not a big issue putting an additional system on in future, as and when you need it, and you can instantly get that kind of best case business case thereafter when you do that.
So in the main, solar installations always incorporated a single inverter. So the panels are generating the energy, and the inverter directs the DC current produced by the panels into the alternating current required to power the building. Now, technology has moved on, and I'm aware myself that you can have, mini micro inverters, which actually then, instead of having one for all of the panels, you have a smaller one on each panel, so they work independently. So can you explain to us if this is also used in commercial installations, and if there are better options today, and if so, the reasons, if there are better options, sorry. And
yeah, sure. Just to go back to the first point, when we say single inverter, yes, it's a single inverter. But if, for example, you've got a 50 kilowatt system, you won't have one inverter doing a 50 kilowatt. You'll probably have 3, maybe 4 inverters. So, but yeah, I know what you mean. On a small scale commercial, you probably have one single inverter. So I suppose if we go with the pros and cons, there's no right or wrong. If we go with the pros and cons, so if you have single inverters and that goes down, you're talking that 50 kilowatt system, you're potentially losing a third of your system, or your whole system if you've got a 20 kilowatt system or 15 kilowatt system. So that is something to consider. Whereas if you had mini inverters and one inverter goes down, you're losing significantly less of your system. Similarly, if you say you had a system that was, for whatever reason, one or multiple panels were shaded for more of the day than another, so maybe one's hadn't been designed that appropriately, and you maybe have a chimney that covers 1 or 2 of the panels, it's less of an issue, because you're not losing the benefit from, you're only losing the benefit from those panels, not losing the benefit kind of across it. What I would say is, these are common in domestic scenarios, as you're aware. The reason for that is cost. So you're talking roughly, give or take, installed £1,500 for a single inverter. You're talking roughly £200 for a mini inverter. So when you're talking 8 panels, which is common for a domestic installation, the cost is negligible. When you're upscaling that to hundreds of panels for commercial, it just doesn't financially stack up, to be honest with you. I suppose the other consideration is space. If you space for these inverters, but primarily it's a financial, it's a simpler install, to be honest with you, the mini inverter, and quite often, as we do see in the domestic world, if there's a simpler way of doing things, the domestic installers will do that. There's nothing wrong with that, but we're certainly not recommending mini inverters at commercial level, certainly not a large scale commercial level. I'd be surprised if other consultants and other contractors are. I don't think contractors would, because I don't think the financials would work for them. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that makes it very clear the difference there, and that certainly makes sense. So when the system's in place, what tells me how much I'm generating?
So most systems these days, certainly all the systems we put in place these days, but most systems in general, have some kind of monitoring system. So you've obviously got your metering system, but to link, we design in a link to either a portal or a web-based system that can then either be picked up via an app on someone's phone, or what I actually prefer to see, and I think is great marketing and is underrated really, is some kind of presentation screen in a reception or on a website or wherever that may be. Because yes, okay, maybe the cost of that setup is £200 to £500, give or take, but the benefit to that it can be untold really. If people are going on your website and they're seeing that people want to work with green companies, it inspires people, it attracts attention, it makes people it gets people talking, to be honest with you. So certainly that's what we would always recommend. But on the kind of lower end of that, it's fairly simple to set up an app-based system that can show you exactly what your system's generated in real time.
I very much like the idea of that. I've been into a company myself, and I've seen that they can, demonstrate that to anybody that walks in schools as well. I think,
Schools
that's,
are brilliant.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, Craig. So the decision's been made. I'm sold on solar energy. What preparations do I need to make before I call you in or before we start this project?
So we touched on it very briefly before, but you're going to need to potentially get a structural engineer involved if you're carrying out a roof installation. You're going to need to get a structural engineer involved, or at least some kind of survey on your roof. That might be a building surveyor, just to make sure your roof can cope with it. Last thing you want to do is invest in PV, then suddenly have a load of roof leaks and other issues. So that's one thing to consider. Contacting the DNO, so the district network operator, and your electricity provider, to let them know that they're. So we would do that, or whatever professional we're engaged would do that. But that's something that needs to happen kind of at that stage, at that feasibility stage. If there's any planning constraints, I know we talked about the planning previously, but if there's any planning constraints that may be in place, that's when we're going to start looking at that. Metering, just making sure it's appropriately metered. You're then kind of feeding into the kind of design stuff, but yeah, those fundamental things really. Your electrical infrastructure, I guess, as well. That, but it's all stuff that you put in that feasibility category. Personally, I would recommend, certainly on a large scale installation, that someone does a high level feasibility before it gets to kind of investment grade level. And a lot of companies, ourselves included, subject to sales engineers or whatever, but would start to look at it as kind of at risk to a certain extent, on the premise that there was a likely project to happen. So yeah, you'd want to get to feasibility stage. Certainly on large scale installations, you'd need to. Domestic, less so. You're probably going to have a contractor who'll tell you everything you need to know. But on commercial and above, you're going to need to have some kind of feasibility done on those various points.
I think it's a fair enough question for a business owner to have in their mind. What sort of disruption is this going to cause to my business during installation? So can you kind of give us an idea of what that would involve?
Yeah, absolutely. So as with any kind of engineering project, you're going to have the obvious ones. So there's going to be some drilling, very basic one, but you're always going to have some drilling. So you need to kind of manage that expectation. That can usually be done at times that are less critical, but it's communication. Depending on the height of your building, and if it's a roof mounted system or whatever, you're going to potentially have scaffolding, so that needs to be considered, and the health and safety implications around that. Not just the users of scaffolding, but the people that are going to be in vicinity of that scaffolding need to be considered. And then on top, the kind of more critical one, I guess, if you want to put it that way, you're going to have a small amount of downtime on your electricity. So you're probably going to have 4 to 8 hours downtime while there's the changeover. So they're the kind of the 3 main things, but in reality, from my experience, they're very easily managed. They sound like big things, but good communication, they shouldn't be a showstopper at all. We've put PV in at care homes, we put PV in hospitals, we put them in fairly critical places, and the users of those buildings haven't even known that it's really been happening, or had very limited knowledge of what's happening. So it's very easily manageable, but it just needs that good communication, really.
Yeah, I think understanding that conversation is important. So no surprises really, isn't it?
Exactly.
So once my panels are installed, what's their upkeep?
Minimal. So in theory, most modern panels are classed as self-cleaning. Self-cleaning. Same as Windows, if you want to put it that way. So even if you had self-cleaning Windows, you would still probably want to give them a good wipe down once in a while. So in reality, we would recommend where possible, giving the panels a good wipe down sort of annually. That is all relative to where you are. So if, with the greatest respect, if you're by the coast and there's a lot of seagulls around, that may need to be done more frequently to keep you. I don't want to go into detail on that, but you get where I'm coming from. Similarly, if you're in a very remote location and there's no birds around and no dust around or whatever, you may get away with it for longer. But they are classed as self-cleaning panels, the majority. But we would recommend giving them a wipe down sort of annually, just to maximize efficiency, really. On top of that, if you're going down the single inverter route, or the inverter serving multiple panel route, they typically last for sort of 8 to 10 years. So you're going to want to budget and replace them within that kind of period. So whenever we do a business case, we kind of budget to replace the panels year 10, and that, if you said the lifespan of the panels was roughly 20-25 years, that kind of covers you. One replacement should cover you for the life of the panel. But you're talking cost-wise, you're probably talking, as I said, £1,500 per inverter, or as a better rule of thumb to account for multiple inverters, sort of 10% of the project cost. So if you had a £50,000 installation, you're going to want to set aside roughly 5k year 10 to cover the cost of inverter replacement.
So my business is now running on solar energy. I think this is a really important question to think about, really, is what changes can I or should I make internally to our processes to get the very most out of every bit of energy we generate? And by that, I mean how we use certain items of equipment, maybe the pull on that energy.
Yeah, I mean, it's not dissimilar from an answer I've given previously, but it's worth hammering home, really, because it's so important to get the maximum benefit out of the PV. But if you're thinking about going down the route of electrical vehicle charging, it sits so well hand in hand with PV. So if almost factor that into your business case, that could improve your business case. If you know you're going down that route anyway, that could make your business case so much better, because you could know that if there's any discrepancy about what sort of size system you're going to go for, that's going to maximize the pull during the daytime. Similarly, the battery storage option, just monitor it, keep an eye on it. It's at that kind of teetering threshold, if you want to put it that way, in the business's professional opinion, where it doesn't quite stack up, but it should do in the not too distant future. And then again, any non-critical in terms of the timings of works that you carry out at a site, if they can be done during the daytime, then great. I mean, using a domestic example, very high level domestic example, if you can do the washing and the drying in the middle of the daytime, then it's a really simple one, but it's going to resonate probably with everyone. You're then going to benefit from the PV performing that task, as opposed to your income electricity supply. So that, having that kind of thought process, yes, every site's different, and there's different things that you could and couldn't do during the daytime. But if there's things that really doesn't matter what time you're doing them, do them in the daytime, so you can benefit from the PV.
I've watched many organizations over the past few years put in solar energy, and it actually changes the ethos, the thinking of the entire company. It seems to start a snowball effect where they think about how they use their energy more because they've got solar. Then they start looking at other areas. It is such an amazing sort of first thing, that people do that changes their business forever. And then I think you've had a really serious scrutinization today, Craig, over this subject. And I would like to link that really to my last question to you. And I believe it's just as an important one.
Yep.
Is my new solar energy system newsworthy? Will it improve the perception of my business? And if so, should I be sharing this story, to enable me to even more monopolize on my investment because of how people think about my company now?
I mean, first and foremost, yes, absolutely. Any renewable technology, obviously including solar, should be celebrated, to be honest with you, not just within the organisation, outside the organisation. It's yeah, the kudos associated with it should be praised wherever it can be. The good thing about solar specifically is that, I mean, 9 out of 10 installations, you're probably going to know that building's got solar, which makes solar kind of, if you want to put it head and shoulders above some of the other technologies. You could put a biomass boiler in and no one would ever know. You might get the benefit from it and the carbon savings, but in reality, only you and a handful of other people know. But solar, you have the opportunity really to market that, to broadcast that. It's broadcasting itself in many instances on the roof, but you can go over and above that. And 100%, yes, it's newsworthy. Every renewable technology group newsworthy, and it should, wherever possible, let people know that it's happening. Let people know what you generate, and let people know what why you've done it, what you've done, and it can make impacts in so many other ways. We talked about schools before, but letting school children know from first principles what the technology is visually. They need to see things visually. They don't need to see it on a screen or whatever. You don't know how that impacts. It can only have a positive impact, and how that's going to impact on their future life, how they use energy, how they think about energy. So yeah, 100%, it's newsworthy. Don't ever think, oh, my system's smaller than the guys down the road. It's not as important. It is as important. Broadcast that, market that.
Yeah. And I think if you flip that on its head as well, it's not just the perception of your business. If you shout about it, another business owner will start to question it and think about it. And before we know it, what a difference we've made to the impact of our businesses on our environment and our communities.
Absolutely.
Craig, thank you so much for joining us today and for your valuable insights into solar energy. As I said, this is the second in the series with Briar and Zenergi, and you'll find a link to the Zenergi website and the case and the link obviously to the first in the series, and we've called on them to do more, so we're working them hard. So in the meantime then, thank you very much for listening, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.